Siam. One topic that I always devote a week to in a seminar is the topic of the transformation of Siam, or what became Thailand, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There is a story about this that has been created that basically says that Siam was never colonized because the monarchs at the time were able to successfully prevent that from happening and to lead the nation towards modernity. Aspects of that narrative are definitely true. However, like any official narrative, there are elements about it that are not, let's say, complete, or there's always another side to the story, and that is what historians have been looking at. Today, people refer to this narrative of modern Thai history as the royalist nationalist narrative. And in the readings from this week, for instance, Thongchai Winichagun has got a great book chapter in which he talks about how that narrative emerged, and particularly with regards to the writing of history. And he shows in that article, for instance, that whereas prior to the 20th century, historical writings in Siam focused on the morality of monarchs, in the early 20th century, that changed to start talking more about the nation and to talk about things like the nation's history of fighting off outsiders, such as the Burmese. What's interesting about this is that this narrative emerged right at a point in history when the Siamese were not successful in fighting off foreigners, and particularly after the French had basically sailed a gunboat up the Chao Phraya River, pointed the cannons at the palace in Bangkok, and ordered the monarch to hand over territory. What's fascinating about that article by Thongchai Winichagun is that we can basically say the exact same thing about other places, particularly Vietnam, and how it was also the case that in the past, historical writings focused on the morality of the rulers, but then in the 20th century that transformed, and this narrative of resistance to foreign aggression emerged right at the time when Vietnamese were struggling to fight off foreign aggressors, if we want to look at things that way. So there are great parallels that we can draw between the scholarship that has been produced on Siam and other places where similar scholarship hasn't quite been written about yet in that kind of detail. Siam is particularly interesting, though, because, like I said, it's this place which supposedly was not colonized, but if you dig deeply and you see the extent of that things like extraterritoriality, the extent to which they affected, let's say, livelihoods in Siam, you start to realize, okay, it wasn't colonized, but it wasn't really not colonized either. And Tamara Luce has a great discussion in the, I can't remember if it was a book chapter or article, I think it was a book chapter that we read this week, where she goes through that terminology and really teases out the problems of terms like colonialism, semi-colonialism, and things like that. Meanwhile, there are a lot of great studies now that look at this transition and the complex ways in which Siam went from this Buddhist-centric to a westernized kind of society, and why that happened. And it all makes for fascinating reading, and it's a really interesting subject.